Okay, so picture this. 1799, George Washington.
Oh, wow.
Arguably the most powerful man, right,
Yeah.
in the newly formed nation,
Hi.
is struck down not by some foreign enemy, but by, get this, excessive bloodletting.
Oh, wow.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it?
Yeah.
About how even medical practices,
Right.
considered, cutting edge at the time,
Of course, yeah.
can have unforeseen consequences.
Absolutely.
And today's deep dive
Okay.
explores another medical practice
Mhm.
that ignited passions,
Right.
sparked, fiery debates, vaccination.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going back to 1919,
Okay.
just after World War I,
Uh-huh.
right in the middle of the Spanish flu pandemic.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the anxieties, the
Yeah.
search for answers, right?
Right.
As people are grappling with a world seemingly turned upside down
Right. Yeah.
into this climate steps, Charles M. Higgins,
Okay.
a successful businessman,
Mhm.
an ink manufacturer to be precise,
Okay.
with a petition to President Woodrow Wilson.
Okay.
Now, you might expect a petition from that era
Yeah.
to be about,
Yeah.
peace treaties, economic recovery.
Right.
But Higgins was on a different mission. He wanted to abolish mandatory vaccination in the Army and Navy,
Wow.
comparing it to, get this, nothing less than slavery.
Wow. What's striking is how he uses that comparison, right, to slavery to highlight the core issue, individual liberty versus government mandates.
Right.
That tension lies at the heart of his argument.
Right.
And it's something that resonates even today, right?
Absolutely.
Especially when we consider the debates surrounding public health measures.
It's a debate that's as relevant now as it was then.
Absolutely.
And to understand the fervor behind Higgins' argument,
Right.
we need to kind of dive into his world,
Okay.
world of 1919,
Mhm.
where the science of immunology was, well,
Yeah.
in its infancy, really.
Yeah.
And anxieties about medical interventions
Sure.
ran high.
Of course.
His petition, titled Horrors of Vaccination,
Mhm.
it's this fascinating mix of passionate rhetoric,
Yeah.
vivid imagery,
Uh-huh.
and what he believed to be hard-hitting evidence.
Okay.
He paints a rather unsettling picture of vaccine production back then, claiming it was, well, unsanitary,
Yeah.
ripe for contamination.
Sure.
He talks about calves being used,
Uh-huh.
pus being collected.
Okay.
Let's just say it was a different time for hygiene standards.
And while we might cringe at those descriptions today,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that sanitation and hygiene practices were vastly different back then.
Oh, absolutely.
The germ theory of disease was still relatively new.
Yeah.
The understanding of viruses and how they spread was still evolving.
So in a way, he was tapping into a very real fear of the unknown,
Absolutely.
of potential contamination
Right.
and unintended consequences.
Of course.
And he doesn't just stop at graphic descriptions.
Right.
He cites specific court cases,
Okay.
legal precedents that he believed called into question the very constitutionality of mandatory vaccination.
Wow.
He invokes terms like unalienable rights,
Yeah.
directly echoing the Declaration of Independence,
Mm-hmm.
clearly trying to strike a chord with that deeply ingrained value of personal liberty.
He's crafting a narrative that goes beyond just the science.
Right.
This is about fundamental freedoms, about the right to bodily autonomy,
Yeah.
about the individual's relationship with the state,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to medical interventions.
And to drive his point home,
Yeah.
he weaves in this rather dramatic anecdote
Cool.
about George Washington's death,
Mm-hmm.
implying that compulsory vaccination
Right.
was akin to the excessive bloodletting
Right, right.
that did our first president in.
He was a master of using historical parallels,
Yeah.
even if they were a bit of a stretch, right?
Right.
To evoke strong emotions
Yeah.
and connect with his audience's values.
It's a tactic.
Oh,
As old as time itself.
absolutely.
Appeal to emotion, tug at the heartstrings.
For sure.
And speaking of heartstrings, Higgins fills his petition with personal stories.
Okay.
Heartbreaking accounts of people claiming they or their loved ones were injured
Wow.
or even killed by vaccination.
These stories, while anecdotal, were a powerful tool for him.
Right.
They gave a human face to the abstract fears
Right.
surrounding vaccination,
Right.
making the potential consequences feel much more real
Sure.
and immediate.
One story that particularly stands out is that of James A. Loyster,
Mm-hmm.
a successful editor and manufacturer
Yep.
who became a fierce anti-vaccination advocate
Yep.
after a devastating loss.
Mm-hmm.
His son, according to Higgins, died from tetanus
Oh, wow.
after being vaccinated.
Oh, no.
This tragedy fueled Loyster's passion,
Great.
leading him to publish a pamphlet
Wow.
titled Vaccination Results in New York State in 1914.
In this pamphlet, Loyster details his son's death
Right.
and those of roughly 30 other children,
Oh.
claiming they were all victims of vaccination.
Wow.
He goes on to paint this grim picture,
Yeah.
claiming more children died from vaccination in New York that year than from smallpox itself.
He's drawing a direct line
Right.
between cause and effect.
Right.
A line that might seem simplistic to us now,
Sure.
but in the context of the time,
Yeah.
with limited understanding of disease transmission and
Yeah.
alternative explanations,
Right.
it would carry significant weight.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that for people like Higgins and Leicester, correlation often equaled causation.
Right.
They didn't have the benefit of decades of scientific research
Yeah.
and rigorous testing to
Right.
differentiate between coincidence
Yeah.
and actual causality.
So they were working with the information they had,
Right.
however limited or flawed it might
Right.
seem to us now.
Right.
And in a way, their stories, their anxieties
Mhm.
reflect a fundamental human struggle.
Sure.
The struggle to make sense of suffering,
Of course.
to find explanations,
Right.
and to exert some control over forces that often feel beyond our grasp.
Absolutely.
It's easy to see how these stories of loss and suffering,
Oh, yeah.
presented as direct consequences of vaccination,
Right.
would have resonated with people,
Yeah.
especially those grappling with similar anxieties and searching for explanations for seemingly inexplicable tragedies.
Absolutely. And Higgins was a master at weaving these personal narratives into his broader critique of vaccination.
Right.
He wasn't just presenting dry statistics or scientific arguments, right?
Right.
He was putting a human face
Yeah.
on what he saw as a dangerous and misguided medical practice.
And it wasn't just his own countrymen he invoked.
Right.
He brought in stories from abroad as well.
Okay.
Like the case of an English soldier who, according to Higgins,
Right.
lost his arm due to complications from a typhoid vaccination.
Wow.
It really paints this picture of widespread suffering transcending national borders.
He also details the case of another English soldier,
Okay.
a young recruit who died after receiving a typhoid shot.
Oh, no.
Higgins attributes this death to a pre-existing heart condition, claiming it wasn't properly diagnosed before the vaccination.
Again, you see that recurring theme of potential harm from medical interventions, especially when those interventions are mandated by the government.
Right.
Without what Higgins saw as proper consideration for individual circumstances
Right.
or the right to refuse.
Precisely. And remember, this was a time before informed consent was a widely accepted practice.
Right.
The idea that individuals should have a say in their medical treatment,
Right.
even if it went against the prevailing wisdom of the time, was still gaining traction.
So Higgins was, in a way, ahead of his time
Yeah.
in advocating for greater patient autonomy
Right.
and a more nuanced understanding of the potential risks associated with medical interventions.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom in his petition. He didn't just rail against vaccination.
Right.
He also proposed solutions,
Okay.
alternative approaches to safeguarding public health that he believed would be more effective and less intrusive on individual liberty.
One of his key proposals was abolishing compulsory vaccination altogether,
Wow.
making it a matter of personal choice rather than government mandate.
Okay.
This idea, radical for its time,
Right.
resonates even today as we grapple with similar debates about vaccine mandates
Right.
and the balance between individual rights and public health.
He was basically advocating for what we now call medical freedom,
Exactly.
the right to make one's own decisions about healthcare,
Right.
even if those decisions go against mainstream medical advice.
And while the concept of medical freedom might seem self-evident to us today,
Right.
it was a radical notion
Yeah.
in the early 20th century,
Right.
especially when it came to diseases like smallpox
Right.
that posed a significant threat to public health.
It's interesting how these debates about individual liberty versus the common good
Oh, yeah.
seem to, ebb and flow throughout history, often resurfacing during times of crisis
Right.
or when new scientific discoveries challenge existing norms and beliefs.
Absolutely. And the early 20th century was a time of immense change and upheaval,
Of course.
both socially and scientifically.
Yeah.
It's no surprise that these fundamental questions about Who gets to decide what happens to our bodies?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to medical interventions.
Yeah.
We're front and center.
And those questions are still with us today.
Very much so.
We might have vastly more knowledge about vaccines and how they work, but the ethical and societal implications of mandatory vaccination remain as complex and contentious as ever.
Precisely. And that's what makes this deep dive into Charles M. Higgins's petition so fascinating.
Right.
It's not just a historical curiosity.
Right.
It's a window into the enduring tension between individual liberty and the common good.
Right.
A tension that continues to shape our public health policies and personal choices today.
It also reminds us that the history of medicine is not a straight line of progress from ignorance to enlightenment.
Right.
It's a much messier and more complex story.
Sure.
Filled with wrong turns,
Yeah.
unintended consequences,
Of course.
and passionate debates about the best way to protect and promote health, both individually and collectively.
And those debates often hinge on more than just the science itself. They're also shaped by social values,
Right.
cultural beliefs,
Right.
and individual experiences.
Right.
To truly understand the history of vaccination,
Yeah.
we need to grapple with those complexities to see beyond the simplistic narratives of heroes and villains
Right.
and appreciate the nuanced perspectives of those who came before us,
Yeah.
even if we ultimately disagree with their conclusions.
So we've explored Higgins' critique of vaccination, his passionate defense of individual liberty,
Right.
and the personal stories he used to bolster his case.
Yeah.
But he didn't stop there.
Right.
He also proposed some pretty radical changes to the way public health was managed in the United States.
One of his most intriguing proposals was the establishment of a National Board of Public Health,
Okay.
but with a twist. He envisioned a board that wasn't just composed of pro-vaccination doctors and scientists,
Right.
but one that included a diverse range of medical opinions,
Okay.
representing what he called the allopathic, homeopathic, and eclectic schools of medicine.
It was a call for greater diversity of thought in public health.
Right.
A recognition that there wasn't necessarily one right answer when it came to complex medical issues.
Right.
He seemed to be advocating for a more inclusive approach,
Yeah.
one that valued open debate and considered a wider range of perspectives.
Yeah, and this idea of having a diversity of opinions in public health,
Yeah.
do you think that's something we still struggle with today?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
We like to think of science as this objective pursuit of truth,
Right.
but the reality is much more nuanced, right?
Sure.
Scientists, like everyone else, are shaped by their biases,
Right.
their areas of expertise,
Sure.
and even their funding sources.
Precisely. And when it comes to complex issues like vaccination,
Right.
where there's always an element of uncertainty and potential risk,
Right.
it's even more important to have a diversity of voices at the table,
Right.
challenging assumptions, asking tough questions,
Right.
and ensuring that decisions are made with transparency and accountability.
Higgins also advocated for something else that might sound very familiar to us today.
Okay.
Laws to compensate families who believed they had been harmed by mandatory vaccinations.
It was an early call for what we might now call vaccine injury compensation programs,
Right.
recognizing that even with the best of intentions,
Yeah.
medical interventions can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And that individuals should have a recourse for seeking redress if they believe they've been harmed.
It speaks to this idea of accountability,
Right.
of ensuring that those who are tasked with protecting public health are also held responsible for the potential harms that those efforts might inflict, however unintentional.
Right.
And it highlights the need for a system that acknowledges the very real anxieties that people have about medical interventions,
Of course.
even those that are widely considered safe and effective.
Absolutely. Trust is paramount when it comes to public health.
Right.
And building that trust requires not just presenting scientific evidence,
Right.
but also listening to concerns,
Right.
acknowledging potential risks,
Yeah.
and ensuring that individuals feel seen, heard, and respected, even if their views don't align with the mainstream.
It's about striking that delicate balance
Yes.
between promoting what we believe to be in the best interest of public health,
Right.
while also respecting individual autonomy and the right to make choices,
Right.
even if those choices go against expert advice.
Exactly. And that balance is something we're still navigating today
Right.
as we grapple with new vaccines, emerging diseases,
Right.
and the ever-present tension between individual liberty and the common good.
Well said.
Thank you.
Now, we've talked a lot about the broad strokes of Higgins' argument,
Right.
but I'm curious to hear more about some of the specific cases he highlights in his petition.
Okay.
You mentioned James Loyster and the tragic death of his son,
Right.
but there are other stories as well,
Yeah.
some quite disturbing, that he uses to illustrate the potential dangers of vaccination.
Yes, there are several other cases that Higgins details in his petition,
Okay.
each one more harrowing than the last.
Oh, wow.
One that he spends a significant amount of time on
Okay.
involves a young boy, just 11 years old,
Okay.
who, according to Higgins, suffered from severe skin eruptions for 3 years following vaccination.
3 years! That's horrifying.
Yeah.
What kind of skin eruptions are we talking about here?
Higgins describes them as blisters,
Oh, wow.
much like the foot and mouth disease he claims was rampant in cattle at the time.
Okay.
He even includes a photograph of the boy in his petition,
Oh, wow.
showing these large, raw sores all over his body.
Oh, my goodness.
It's a pretty gruesome image,
Right.
clearly intended to shock and appall the reader.
It's hard to imagine the suffering that poor boy endured.
Yeah.
Did Higgins offer any explanation for what caused this horrific reaction?
He attributes it, of course, to contaminated vaccine virus,
Right.
claiming it was a clear case of what he calls virulent cowpox.
Okay.
He goes on to claim that a doctor examining the boy diagnosed him with pemphigus,
Okay.
a rare skin disease,
Right.
and that another man who developed pemphigus after being vaccinated with the same batch of virus later died.
He's really connecting the dots there,
Right.
building a case for widespread contamination and serious health risks associated with vaccination.
Exactly. And while it's impossible to know for sure what caused that boy's illness
Right.
or whether it was actually linked to the vaccination,
Yeah.
Higgins uses the case to full effect.
Painting a picture of a medical establishment that was either willfully ignorant of the dangers of vaccination or actively covering them up.
It's a theme that runs throughout his petition.
Right.
This deep distrust of authority, of experts,
Yeah.
of the very institutions that we're supposed to be looking out for the public's health and well-being.
And that distrust, that skepticism of authority
Right.
is something that resonates even today, isn't it?
Absolutely.
We see it in various forms, from
Right.
skepticism about government institutions to questioning of scientific consensus.
Right.
It's a reminder that trust, once broken, can be very difficult to rebuild.
It's a reminder that we're all part of this ongoing conversation about how we balance,
Yeah.
individual freedom with the need to protect the collective good. Absolutely.
It's a balancing act that every generation seems to grapple with,
Right.
especially when faced with new and uncertain threats to public health.
And those uncertainties can easily breed fear and distrust,
Right.
as we've seen throughout history and even in our own time.
Speaking of unsettling cases,
Yes.
Higgins also describes a woman who, after vaccination,
Right.
developed this severe blistering rash
Oh, wow.
all over her body, similar to what the young boy experienced.
Okay.
Tragically, she was hospitalized and died just 6 weeks later.
That's just awful.
And again,
Yeah.
he attributes her death to contaminated vaccine virus.
Precisely. He uses this case and others like it to bolster his argument for abolishing mandatory vaccination and giving individuals greater control over their own bodies and health decisions.
It's a strategy that clearly resonated with people at the time,
Oh, yeah.
tapping into deep-seated anxieties about medical authority
Right.
and the potential for harm from interventions that were often poorly understood.
He then goes on to describe a particularly horrific case from England
Okay.
involving an infant who was vaccinated
Right.
and subsequently developed these terrible sores in her mouth.
Sores in her mouth. In a baby. That's just awful. How could that have happened?
According to Higgins, the baby's mother accidentally vaccinated herself on her breasts while nursing. He suggests it might have happened through contact with the baby's saliva.
Oh my goodness, that is just heartbreaking. What
Yeah.
happened to the baby?
Sadly, the baby died after a week of intense suffering.
Oh no.
Higgins describes the sores spreading all over her tiny body,
Oh my goodness.
covering the inside of her mouth,
Oh.
even choking up her throat.
Oh wow.
It's a truly horrific image,
Yeah.
one that he uses to full effect to evoke outrage and disgust at what he saw as the dangers of vaccination.
It's a powerful reminder that storytelling has always played a crucial role in shaping public opinion,
Absolutely.
especially when it comes to emotionally charged
Oh,
issues
of course.
like health and disease.
Absolutely.
And while we might question the accuracy of some of Higgins's claims today,
Right.
or at least acknowledge the limitations of the medical knowledge available at the time,
Right.
we can't deny the emotional power of his storytelling,
Right.
the way he connects with his audience's deepest fears and anxieties.
It's a reminder that science communication isn't just about presenting facts and figures.
Right.
It's also about understanding the power of narrative,
Right.
of empathy,
Yeah.
and of addressing the very real emotions that people bring to the table when making decisions about their health and well-being.
Well said. And as compelling as some of these stories might seem,
Yeah,
we have to remember that they're just that, stories. They might
definitely.
hint at potential risks, but they don't tell the whole story.
Of course not.
And they certainly wouldn't meet the rigorous standards of evidence that we expect in modern medical research.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the importance of scientific literacy,
Right.
of being able to critically evaluate information,
Right.
especially when it comes from sources that might have an agenda, even a well-intentioned one.
It's about being able to separate the anecdotes from the evidence, the emotions from the data,
Right.
and to make informed decisions based on the best available information.
Exactly. And that's something that's just as important today,
Oh, absolutely.
if not more so,
Right.
as we navigate a world awash in information, misinformation,
Sure.
and strong opinions on every side of every issue.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to start wrapping up this fascinating deep dive
Right.
into the world of Charles M. Higgins and his passionate crusade against vaccination.
It's been quite a journey exploring the historical context,
Right.
the anxieties of the time,
Hmm.
and the enduring tension between individual liberty and the common good.
It's amazing how a document from over a century ago can still spark such relevant and thought-provoking conversations today.
Indeed, it's a reminder that while the science of vaccination has advanced dramatically since Higgins's time,
Right.
the ethical and societal questions surrounding it
Right.
remain as complex and relevant as ever.
And with that,
Yeah.
we'll leave you with this final thought.
Okay.
As you encounter debates about vaccination today,
Right.
about new vaccines, about mandates and exemptions,
Right.
remember the story of Charles M. Higgins and his fight against what he saw as medical tyranny.
It's a reminder to approach these issues with both empathy and a discerning mind,
Right.
to seek out reliable information,
Right.
and to engage in respectful dialogue, even when those conversations are difficult.
Because ultimately, the health of our communities depends on our ability to find common ground, to
Absolutely.
balance individual rights with the collective good, and to make informed decisions based on the best available evidence,
Right.
even in the face of uncertainty and fear.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a fascinating chapter in the ongoing story of vaccination.
Thank you.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.